I'll send you on that one. I don't know if I can talk. I was at hazard mitigation planning track. Just as a former project impact coordinator in North Carolina, if anything, no matter how you feel about that program, one thing I learned is no matter, I would have to argue with anybody who could not acknowledge that it was a very successful branding program. People understood what project impact stood for, what it meant. We didn't get hung up on terminology or words, at least in the practitioner community. I think we're less reluctant to do that. But I was down in Wrightsville Beach one day, and after our ribbon cutting ceremony, and James Lee Witt had just left, somebody came up to me and said, "I want project impact for my house." I didn't sit there and debate with her. Well, you don't really understand. It's not a grant program for you, and it's not. No, she got it. It's a brand. It was project impact. She knew it meant disaster resiliency or disaster resistance in her mind. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think we need to definitely spend less time debating definitions and just focusing on the brand, which each community may want to sell. And in Tulsa, it's Tulsa Partners. I think it's great.
I'd like to expand a little on one thing Tim said, because I don't want to leave the impression that we're talking about creating an alliance similar to the alliance that is now going on, the Mitigation Alliance. I think what a couple of us felt pretty strongly about was that it would be a good idea to create a coalition of people who are focused on building disaster-resilient communities, or resistant. I'm not going to argue about the terminology. We get the concept, right? And that would include probably a number of different federal agencies, some foundations, private businesses. I don't really know the scope of it or the shape of it yet, but I would call it, I think Margaret and I kind of agreed, that the words Disaster Resilient Communities Coalition or Resilient Communities Coalition was the recommendation that some of us made. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I want to emphasize that the NHMA board will need to discuss this in more detail. These are just recommendations at this point.
Right. And the NHMA role is not defined either.
On this resistance, resilient thing, isn't resistance the ability to resist something from happening to begin with? And resilience is the ability to recover from something after it's happened? So
we're not in charge of the terminology, to tell you the truth. We could argue terminology all day if we want,
but are we
what's
really
the point?
interested in both of those things? The
Yes.
ability to prevent it from happening, and then also our ability to recover quickly once it does?
Yeah, and I think most of the people that were involved in the decision making on the Disaster Resilient Community Committee that recommended we go with that name would agree with you and would assume that disaster resistance was a part of disaster resilience. But we don't want to get caught up on the terminology, honestly. If it helps at all, look at what Project Impact did in the communities and picture that as disaster resilience.
Well said.
Other comments? Lori?
I was just going to say, since we're talking about naming and branding and so forth, I was sitting by a wily Canadian at lunch, Lori Pierce, and I told her about this disaster resilient communities, and she immediately said, but what about the disaster resilient cities initiative through the United Nations? And so it's actually called Making Cities Resilient, but they do go by disaster resilient cities. And right now there are 400 communities around the world, and there's one in the United States, and it's North Little Rock, Arkansas. And so, I mean, I don't know what this means for this branding. I don't know if you want any sort of global link, but I just wanted to bring it up since we're talking about it.
Anybody else have a question, comment?
I'm Bob Anderson, and one of the things that doing a lot of contract management over a long period of time that adds confusion, especially when you look at documents from many years ago, has been having specific workable terms of art when needed in contracts or in particular complex projects. Now, a lot of mitigation projects can be highly complex. Some can actually be simple. With that, the presidential directive that we were given last night, a copy of, has actually resilience defined on page 6, item number C. So you may have a notional definition that is needed project to project. But when it comes to agreements and talking with new staff and people from other areas, I think, especially with the federal government, using their term of art as it's clearly defined here gives you a starting point. And then you can change things or add to it as per this agreement, this term means this. So that's how I would approach it. So I have this trouble all the time between engineers and seismologists. Yeah.
Do we have anybody else in the room with further comment?
I'd love to
Please.
George Sullivan, American Red Cross. I think it may be helpful to, not for the purpose of defining resilience, but perhaps from thinking about our approach towards the subject, to imagine the newspaper headline afterwards, and what does the community look like in the aftermath of a disaster, and what would the story read like? That may help us get our head wrapped around it. For instance, the people stayed, the businesses reopened, services were available. What was the time frame for that? What kind of resources came into play to make that happen? That's all I had.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Ed?
One more, and I failed to identify myself. I'm Ed Thomas from the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association. Following up on that very excellent comment about defining this by outcome, there's an excellent report from the Association of State Floodplain Managers on the second Gilbert White Forum that talked about the headlines in a paper after a massive and natural flood comes through an area, and it's a big yawn. There's no damage, no hardship, no environmental desolation, no suffering, no misery. And I think that would help us define the outcome that we seek. And this was a paper that was put together by 100 of the top experts in the United States. So I think we could fold that into our definition of resilience as an end goal.
Is there anybody else? I, for one, would like to come back to something that Lori said, talking about international examples, and ask the group, in everything that we have been talking about in terms of mitigation, resiliency, planning, disaster resilient communities, if you do or don't see linkages there, and how do we fit into that broader context? Not everybody at once. See, I've got two people up front, but I think they can answer the question. Do you have any initial comments on that?
Well, I was actually in a session where somebody made a comment, international partnerships, and it was actually a session Bill Hook was doing. He was saying to everybody, keep it to 1 or 2 word responses and answers. And he said international partnerships, and I said yes. So my answer to you is yes. It's something we need to look at. There are a number of partners who work on the national stage, who are international in scope, including your employer, Save the Children, who I've worked with locally in Tulsa on disaster issues. I think we need to, if I was to make a recommendation to NHMA, it would be my recommendation that we start with those international organizations that have a presence in the United States. Red Cross would be another organization, and look at how they're doing things on the international stage and see how it applies.
Folks, it's already being done. Our insurance companies like, Munich Re, Swiss Re, FM Global, our internationalization of commerce and our industry is already looking at that. When something happens internationally, such as the situation in Japan, believe us, it affects the economy here in the U.S. So we have started it, but it's not at usually the public sector level. It's right now primarily being done at the private sector level.
Does anyone have?
Dick Krajewski. What is appealing to me and looking at kind of international stuff with mitigation and resilience is their definitions maybe of resilience may be very, very different than ours because they may consider different kinds of lifestyles. And so I think it's important to know that in third world countries, resilience may look very different than it does here, and we may need to take those definitions seriously.
May.
Following up on the international thought, the clearest statements I have ever seen by public officials on the need when one is dealing with response and recovery to stop making things worse, but instead make them better in terms of hazard mitigation, harm prevention, plain common sense, or whatever you care to call it, have come from the International Committee. If you look online with the folks from the USAID, they have quotes from the Secretary General of the United Nations on exactly that topic. There was a wonderful webcast that we can disseminate the information that talks about this from the folks at the American Red Cross who do international relief, saying that we have to stop worrying about making our response and recovery operations more efficient and start working on making the consequences of natural phenomenon less because of improper practices. And lo and behold, the acting director of USAID said that emphatically and clearly. And I'm not seeing that as much from our domestic folks. So I really like Lori's idea, I like your idea of weaving in the international viewpoint and having, saying, hey, look, these guys have got it. Let's spread that word. Thank you.
I would like to add to that based off of two comments from yesterday. One was made by Steve Murdoch, and I don't recall if it was made in his presentation or in a conversation I had with him prior. And it involved the fact that the changes in the economy and their negative effects on some individuals may redefine what folks can do for mitigation and what is resiliency. And that resonates to me as well with some of Dennis Milletti's comments regarding income disparities and what does that mean for what people can do. And I don't know if anybody wants to say anything to that end, because I think that ties in very well to what Dick commented on, that maybe that international definition of resiliency is not as far away as we might think.